Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to hand it over to Julie in just a second. Julie has been instrumental in a lot of the thinking of this book. She works at BuzzFeed and is my favorite fellow, old millennial feminist. And as I was preparing for the book, I talked through a lot of these ideas with her. She read several of the chapters, and I thought that I would be most comfortable and most excited to talk with someone who's deeply familiar with a lot of these ideas. And I want to thank too my editor Kate, who is here, and my agent Allison, both of who believed in me way before I was anywhere near New York or BuzzFeed, and also all of the people at Penguin who helped make this happen. So thank you. All right, Julie.
Hi, you guys. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, and Helen, for asking me to talk about your amazing book today. So for anyone who has not yet read it, Too Fat, Too Slutty, Too Loud is all about the rise and possibly fall of unruly women. So I think the first question that I want to know about is why this topic? Why unruly women? Why now? What about unruliness is attracted you to the subject?
So when I first pitched this book 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, I think we really were at this cusp, or apex of unruliness. All of the people that we were talking about all the time, women, most of them were unruly in some way. So this was kind of peak Amy Schumer, right after Clear Eyes, Full Hearts Don't Rape came out, and Broad City had just come out, and I had written actually a short essay about the first couple episodes of Broad City that was all about their unruliness, which developed in a very different way into the chapter that's in the book. But also, Lena Dunham had sold her book for $1 billion, and Caitlyn Jenner was going to come out in the next couple of months. There was just, it felt like we're working towards this mountain of unruly celebration, and a lot has happened in the 2 years since then, both in terms of where I was last summer when I was writing the book, which was fast. The original book pitch did not have Hillary Clinton as one of the women that I would talk about. And it also included Amy Schumer, which is something that she's not in the book anymore. But writing it last summer, I came to a lot of conclusions about Hillary that then I had to revise over the last 6 months. And I think what has happened over the last year is the decline in the pushback against unruliness has become visible. It had been happening, but I don't think I or most people were aware of just how forceful it was until after the election. So unruliness first because it was cool, and now because it's not as cool.
So for anyone who hasn't read the book, how do you define unruliness? I think we should sort of start out with the same sort of lexicon.
Right. I always think of it as too much, just in general. When you if you hear about someone or you're trying to describe someone that you've encountered to someone else and you say oh, she was just too much. And what you mean is either she took up too much space in some way, too much vocal space, too much physical space. She talked too much in the meeting. She, wouldn't, stop talking about herself or about something that was bothering her. She just had a presence that was too much for what we usually these lines that we put around what proper feminine behavior should be like. And so anyone who steps outside of that line, and there's so many ways that you can step outside, and much more than just the 10 kind of overarching categories that I list in the book, but anyone who oversteps those bounds can become unruly in some way.
And so in the way that we think about unruliness in this book, unruliness is definitely a gendered concept.
Yeah, I think you and I were talking about can a man be unruly? I think there are ways to perform unruly masculinity, and most of them involve not being super masculine. And those performances and those boundary crossing moments are definitely denigrated in different ways, but I think that there's a policing of women. Let me put it this way. I think that masculinity is still, especially in America, really, really circumscribed in terms of like ways that you can be a man. But I think that the way that we punish women who don't fit into the circumscribed understanding of femininity is much harsher.
So if unruliness is something that only women can possess, and what is it about this particular moment in time and the way that women are enacting unruliness that is so sort of captivating?
Yeah, so like we were talking about before, unruliness is so yoked to wherever the societal standard is. So like there were women who were unruly in the 1600s, right? Like there were women who were unruly in 1950. Like I think that and those women have always absolutely beguiled, people that are around them in their own personal lives, but also on like the star or celebrity level. You can look back historically and you can see these kind of blips of unruly women who have popped up. But in order to maintain the status quo of like what proper femininity is, they have to be rejected forcefully. Like they can be popular for a little bit and then it has to be like, nope, like you have to be labeled as or rejected or made invisible or rejected in some way in order to kind of maintain that status quo. And so I think what fascinated me about the late 2000s was that it seemed to be this really prolonged period of unruliness, and also unruliness that spread across more than just, white straight girls, like telling poop jokes. Like it seemed to embrace different types of bodies, but also sexualities and a lot of different racial ways of enacting unruliness. And so that to me, like the fact that, okay, it's so easy for me to come up with 10 women who are working through this, like that seemed very compelling. And I wonder if you could think of 10 women, like for me right now, if I were gonna write another book, like it wouldn't necessarily be about celebrities right now so much as like what women post-Trump are doing in unruly ways. Like I'm less interested in what celebrities are doing right now than how I am interested in what actual citizens are doing. So.
Yeah, and I think that right now the celebrity culture is as much impacted by Trump and the post-Trump landscape as any other group. And I think that the women in this book are sort of also reeling in sort of any of is in the same ways that everyone else is, and they're all kind of expressing their own responses, and in some ways they're conforming, and in other ways they are also sort of rebelling. So can you talk a little bit about how these women can both be unruly in some spaces, but also reinforce standards in other spaces? I think one of the best examples of that in your book is someone like Kim Kardashian, who you bring up as an example of someone who was too pregnant and who really rejected a lot of the tropes about pregnancy, the common tropes about pregnancy as being like the best time of your life as a woman and the most glorious moments that you can ever experience as a female, but then also reinforces a lot of standard ideas that we have about what a woman should be and what femininity should look like.
Right. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of the kind of facile conversation that we have about female celebrities is, are they feminist or not? Right? Well, first of all, just asking them in interviews, like, are you a feminist, right? Without actually defining the terms or just asking them what even being a feminist would mean to them. Like if Taylor Swift says she's a feminist and, Katy Perry says she's a feminist and Miley Cyrus says she's a feminist, like what is feminism? But I'm like in the case of Kim Kardashian, who has often said like very, derogatory things about feminism, or like it just indicates a profound misunderstanding of feminism when she says things like, I'm not a free the nipple kind of girl, so I'm not a feminist. Like, just doesn't understand. But so what I'm interested in then is how did her body betray her idea of what it meant to be a woman, or her idea of how her life would go. She had exercised such control over her entire image for so long, and then her pregnancy just turns into something that she didn't imagine, that she didn't want to be, that turned her miserable. So how did she work through those things, and how did other people watching that react to and work through them? Like, how did other people try to legislate her body, and how did she react to that, you know? One thing that's interesting, someone actually said on that chapter is an excerpt on BuzzFeed right now, and someone in the comments said, I didn't know this, that she recently said in one of the episodes that she didn't realize that you don't become a woman or she didn't become a real woman until she became a mother, right? Which not only it's like she is reactivating this very contained idea of what maternity and femininity, like she's re-inscribing it, even though she rejected it so forcefully. It's like she had the second pregnancy that was okay, and now it's like she's amnesia about her bad pregnancy and how she reacted.
Well, I also think that someone like Kim Kardashian understands how important her image is to selling herself in the culture, and understands that her image is what she is marketing constantly. And so part of her job is reifying that image constantly over and over and over again. And so anytime the facade slips and she says, you know, pregnancy was terrible and I hate this and I'm miserable, and can no longer keep that image up and maintain it, then she's in some ways like losing control over her ability to sell herself and market herself.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's what pissed her off most about what happened with her pregnancy. It wasn't that she was had a potentially life-threatening condition. Right. It was that it was out of her control. And I mean, I just think she, like many other women in the book, are struggling right now. They're not as popular as they once were. They're not as vital. They're not as central to the conversations. Keeping Up with the Kardashians ratings are way, way down. And part of that is I have this theory right now that there's a vacuum of white celebrity because we're trying to figure out as a country how we feel about whiteness and white femininity in general. And there's Ivanka as this avatar of white femininity that a lot of women either aspire to and many other women define themselves against. Or if Ivanka is the inverse of unruliness, right? I'm not allowed, in the book, I don't get to say ruly. The copy editor said I wasn't allowed to say ruly, but Ivanka is ruly. And even, Melania is ruly. And those moments of rupture, when she swats Donald hand, that's why we pick up on them, is because we want some example of unruliness.
Right.
This started in a very different place. But basically, I encourage you reading through these chapters to think about, I wonder what's going to happen to each of these women from this point forward. I actually think of all of them Nicki Minaj has the clearest path forward.
Yeah, I think that that's another really interesting thing to think about is what is the path of unruliness? Even if it's calculated in some way, in a way that, I think that for some of the women that you mention, it is more calculated than others. For sure with someone like Caitlyn Jenner, her unruliness is certainly calculated in a different way and strategized because it has to be.
Right.
There is certainly a path that the unruliness travels down, and that it cannot sustain itself at the same peaks that it may at one point. So there may be a peak and a valley and a peak and a valley, but then at a certain point you have to ask yourself, what is the end point of it?
Right. Well, I think Madonna is actually a really interesting example here, because Madonna treaded that fine line of unruliness for so long, and a lot of her unruliness I don't think was actually political so much as inflammatory. It was just purposefully, I like treading this line. And then when she got older, she was like, oh, well, the unruly thing I can do is say, well, you can be older and sexy. But the problem, and this is, I think, the surprising thing to me in researching the chapter, is that it's not that Madonna thinks older women can be sexy. It's that older women who look like her can be sexy. And she's a person who has like fiercely regimented her body. So it's, if you look like you're 25 when you're 60, then you can be sexy. Not if you're 60, you can be sexy.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that's interesting in many of the women that are featured in this book, is that there are still limits for all of them, right? There are still limits on how these things can be expressed and how they can be performed. And ultimately, there is a limited freedom to all of this. And, and that made me think a lot about the question of like, what is beyond unruliness, right? What is the idea, what exists beyond unruliness? Is there a category in which women exist beyond the category of unruliness, or beyond that level of boundary breaking? And what is it, and where does it live, and how is it expressed?
Yeah, I mean, there are a ton of women, both public figures and just people, people who are actually truly unruly. And that means that they're either rejected by their jobs, by their friends, by their family. They're invisible. They can't get jobs. Like truly unruly celebrities, like Leah DeLoreo is a great example. Like she's actually too queer for pop culture in a lot of ways. And she can't get, she's a wonderful actress, an amazing, she's super funny, cannot get mainstream gigs because there's no place in mainstream entertainment for a masculine lesbian, right? So she actually is pressing that line of too queer in a way that Caitlyn Jenner, who is incredibly transnormative, which is another word that the spell checker did not like, but you will know as soon as you, who is incredibly transnormative, can actually very much, like Caitlyn Jenner is by no means actually too unruly, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think that there's sort of a big question for all of us, reading the book, or women in this room, or people in this room, women identified people and others, is where do we want our culture to go? Do we want to accept the Lena Dunhams of the world and the Madonnas of the world, or are we going to push things further? I think that we have a lot, especially considering the constraints that are being pushed upon us right now in the culture. There is the status quo would say that these are the sort of voices of dissent, but like, are there further voices that we could be pushing further out?
You're trying to be a radical
I'm
Marxist
trying to be a
feminist.
I'm trying to be a radical Marxist feminist because I am a radical Marxist feminist.
And this is the thing, is that all of these women are very much like, even the most radical of them are not radical.
Right.
Like they are all not only like within capitalism, but also, they have made concessions in order to be popular.
Right.
Or in order to be mainstream, all of them. And I think that, like, if anything, these women are posing questions that I think continue to, need to be asked over and over again. Like, they're making you think, okay, so like, maybe they broke that one barrier, but when that's broken, how do we paper over, how do we reinscribe that line? Mm-hmm. How is it actually harder for people after Lena Dunham? Right, because there's such a pushback against Lena Dunham. Like, how has she actually made it more difficult for women who have bodies like hers to break in? Like, if there's already this rhetoric that's developed around a body like hers, which isn't to say, like, obviously, I think that it's of worth. But what's disheartening is that I think every time that there's been feminist progress, there's also always this pushback. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But even if you're doing 2 steps forward, 1 step back, you still go forward. But it's hard in our position to be like, oh, well, look here we are in 1992 again. You know what I mean? Like, oh, here we are in like post-feminism. Like, are we gonna, like, is there gonna be a new backlash to the progress that so many of us experienced over the course of the 2000s? And I think yes, like we see it with what's going on right now. So, but I do think, the conclusion to the book is much less about these celebrities and much more about how we as readers, as thinkers, can respond to them. Because I think a lot of times consumers of these celebrities, and especially women, are oftentimes the harshest on the female celebrities around us. And to say that, to ask to approach them with compassion is not to say to forgive them or to not ask questions or not to ask them to be better. It's more to think about, like, okay, so what are they trying to maneuver right now? What lines are they breaking? Like, how difficult is this to try to be in this position that they're in?
At the conclusion of your book, you say, at some point, every one of these women has failed, or perhaps more generously, presented inconsistencies in her resistance. Those moments shouldn't be read as failures, however, so much as testaments to the sheer tenacity of the ideologies of femininity that shame, alienate, and expel those who refuse them.
Yeah. And like, I try to be forgiving with myself when I, think something not only of a celebrity, but also of, women that I might encounter, or of my own body or performance or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, there are moments when all of us are like, oh, that was too much. And so I'm trying to be better at like, not buying into the ideologies that like discipline myself and discipline all other women too. And that's something people are always like, well, why study celebrity? Like, these people, you don't know them, you don't know anything about them. I mean, study celebrity because it has real life effects on the way that you treat and conceive of women in the world around you. That's my answer. Yeah. So.
Great. Well, we have time for some questions. If anyone has any questions for Anne Helen.
You choose.
Since you do have a PhD in the gossip industry,
yeah.
I'm really curious. You write a lot about gossip being inherently like political, the gossip media, because it's always like reinforcing or pushing back against different values. But with the actual like political like ownership of gossip media, I'm just curious with the purchase of Us Weekly by the ultra-conservative company, like if you think that there's got to be more of a difference, a political line in the way that gossip is like sold or told, and if there's going to be like alternative facts in the gossip industry.
So this is a great question, and one of my dissertation is on the history of the gossip industry. So like the first book that I tried to sell that didn't sell was on like the history of the gossip industry. Like there's a whole chapter about like Us Weekly. I was like, people want to read this? And they're like, no one wants to read this, but I hope you want to read it. So I have actually spent a fair amount of time with the editor-in-chief of the National Enquirer and of American media who purchased Us Weekly. And what's fascinating to me, he bought it not with the intention of turning it into a Trump rag. Like he already has his Trump rag, and that's the National Enquirer. He conceives of each different publication serving a different audience. Now, I don't know, has anyone looked closely at Us Weekly recently, like in the last month? There's a lot less celebrity and a lot more of like my perfect beach body. And so it's regulating femininity, not in the way that the National Enquirer is, but in a different way. So it's the same conservative ideology. It's just working in different ways. It's like, instead of having Ivanka on the cover, it's how do you have a body like Ivanka's? Even if that's not explicit, it's implicit. Does that make sense? So yes, I think ownership absolutely matters with this stuff. I think People magazine is really interesting to watch right now because, having been part of, one of their writers was one of the people who accused Trump of sexual impropriety and harassment. And after the election, they had this Donald Trump's celebratory cover, and there was real pushback about the hypocrisy of that. And I think they are trying to figure out a place right now where they can cater to what Lainey Gossip calls the miniman majority, right? Which a lot of them voted for Trump, where they can cater to those women. And also People magazine is the magazine that's keeping Time Inc. afloat. So there's a lot of things, a lot of people depend on them. But also, if there's no other white female celebrities right now, that's why you see all these HGTV stars on the front of these magazines. So that's interesting, but great question, thank you.
It just popped into my head when you were talking about there aren't that many white celebrities at the moment, but do you have any thoughts about Gweneth Paltrow? She just had this whole gigantic Goop health event, so I was just wondering if you had thoughts about her.
I mean, like, I've always appreciated how bald-faced she is in her bourgeoisness. Like, she just, like, it's kind of like Martha Stewart. Like, she is just so aggressive and unapologetic in it that there's something, like, I like that, unlike someone like Reese Witherspoon, who tries to maybe couch it in, like, this middle classness. I like that Gwyneth Paltrow is like, my parents were movie stars. Of course, I have refined taste. But I do think that she is a fascinating example of someone who is like, so a term I use sometimes is called the Ivanka Voter, which is like a woman who voted for Trump, who is kind of like grossed out by Trump, but kind of held their nose and was like, oh, okay, like as long as he produced Ivanka and Ivanka's classy, like I can vote for him. Also taxes, like I want low taxes and I only look out for me and mine. And in a lot of ways, like that's the Gweneth demo. But then she's also like socially liberal and, has successfully propagated the idea of like conscious uncoupling, which is actually like kind of a cool idea without the language. Like you just think of a different word for it. But like how much, and she's also a brilliant businesswoman. Like she was doing the newsletter before everyone was doing newsletters. She makes a lot of money from that and like can kind of pick to do whatever she wants. And that idea that movie stars now, they don't really make money. They don't have like these $12 million, $20 million paychecks from movies unless they're in superhero movies, but they have lifestyle brands that keep them kind of on the cusp or the forefront of celebrityness. She pioneered that. So for me, like, there's a lot of things that are absolutely disgusting and laughable about her, but I also, like, from an analysis point of view, I think she's fascinating.
I'm gonna stand up so you can't see. So obviously, like I feel like a hot topic on the internet and in other places lately has been the sort of branding of feminism, like feminist bachelorette party T-shirts and like feminist lipstick. And I'm curious, do you see either like happening already or happening in the future a moment in which unruliness is packaged and then sold back to us, sort of in that style?
Oh, totally. Like, look at all of these like there's this store, I live in Brooklyn, and there's this store on Court Street in Carroll Gardens where it's like all women, like age 37 to 42, and it's like a little boutique, and it has like nasty women, like T-shirts, right? Which I understand the impulse, but this store, like they're, $42 T-shirts, or the way that all of you are probably, including myself, marketed to on Facebook for like all of this feminist like yoga gear. I don't know what's that. Yeah, and
I feel like there's like a lot of like wine mom culture. That's kind of like unruly wine mom.
Yeah, it's like it's like totally, like, which is like the wine mom thing is fascinating because it's like you're like, I need it, like mommy needs a drink because she's tired. You're like, yeah, because she's still taking on all of the domestic labor because like patriarchy,
Right. But you got her like a $32 T-shirt, so it's cool.
Yeah. It's like really passive aggressive
for sure.
Like if you're wearing it, like you don't know how to say like to actually get mad at your husband, so instead you're like, mommy needs to drink, like, and buy like the wine that has like
there's a mug, there's
feminist
like, there's
bitch
so many
wine.
Like there's so many accoutrements that go with like your passive aggressiveness.
Super
marketed.
And like, but again, that's often because women don't actually want to be unruly. Like actually having a profound conversation with your partner about unequal division of labor, it's really hard. and also bucks like everything that women are told about how to maintain a successful partnership and like, you know, how to make things easy for everyone. And so instead you buy the accoutrements.
Don't you feel like, I feel like stuff like The Skim is also like, sorry, little, like
Yeah.
Lenny Letter and The Skim, like some of that is a little bit of like marketing, like unruly marketing.
Oh yeah, like unruly marketing. I think
Yeah.
that there is definitely, I think there's definitely this understanding, like, how do I put this? It's kind of like how in the late 90s, early 2000s, those of you who were out of elementary school at that time, like girl power
Yeah.
was marketed that way.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about girl power and Spice Girls is like it was marketing female empowerment, but it was in a very different way than say Riot Girl and radical feminism was doing it. So much safer, there's less stakes. And that's not to say that I don't think like there's really, especially on Lenny Letter, that there is really great stuff on there, and it's an entryway. You know, like growing up, you know, my mom never talked to me about feminism other than to say like when you watch The Little Mermaid, like she'd be like, there's a reason why Ariel had to give up her voice to get a man, like, but that's feminist. She just never called it that. But so having something like Lenny Letter available to me, or Rookie, or all those things, like would have been a real gateway to the unruly radical feminist that I've become. But the last thing I want to say is that Andy Zeisler, who is the editor-in-chief of Bitch Magazine, and she writes all the time about what's called commodity feminism, which is like the kind of the emptying out of feminism in order to be part of capitalism. And I talk about it a little bit in the book and in my writing elsewhere, but it really, I think it evacuates unruliness of its potency.
Hi. I was recently talking to my mom yesterday about, just because this popped into my head, because you were talking about women, especially now in the age of the media, like it is easy to criticize a public figure because everyone has a phone and all that. My Megyn Kelly was on the television. I know you mentioned her briefly in the introduction, and I was talking with my mom, and we were actually talking about like, you know, Sean Hannity, Megyn Kelly, Rachel Maddow, like, and I'm like, well, you know, in terms of criticism and, you know, align women and men, like, I think that in my opinion, like the thing that's different is that like sex is used as a weapon in negative comments towards women, like public figures.
Right.
So which is terrifying to me as a woman and just as a person. But I wanted to ask you, like, I was just curious, in your writing as a woman and in your writing of other women, in terms of comment on your own work and comments you've seen, like, do you encounter a, for lack of a better term, equal mix of that criticism, women insulting women, or do you see a lot of that kind of sex as a weapon, like?
Yeah. So the first thing that's really, I think a lot of times men think the biggest insult you can levy at a woman is that she's unfuckable, right? And that's something that people, like, I think levy at Rachel Maddow, and she's like, great, I don't want any of you guys to want to do that, you know? And Megyn Kelly and all of the women of Fox, like, Roger Ailes hired them because they were appealing to the male gaze. Like, he gave them makeovers. He made them do a little twirl so that he could see their legs before he hired them. He had cameras that like zoomed in on their legs. Like, that was all part of, okay, so we have a woman on the news every night. How can we make them palatable? Is make them all look the same, right? And from that question, I will say, so online, my avatar on Twitter is the 1920s photo of Clara Bow, who's a silent film star. People often are like, oh, you don't look like that. But it does, like, I kind of love that what it makes is that so people will be like, oh, you're so ugly. And I'm like, oh, you called the biggest star of the late 1920s ugly. Like, it doesn't, you know, you can tell then that they're using it not to actually comment on anything about you so much as a missile to try to make you feel lower than them. And oftentimes, I think almost all comments in that direction are because you've made that person feel uncomfortable in some way, right? And it doesn't have to, like, they're not, the process doesn't look like, oh, well, she's challenging patriarchy, so I should, like, talk about her appearance. Like, that's not, but what it does is it kind of, keeps the discussion of women on the internet very much on their value as sex objects and their appearances instead of about their ideas, which would be much more difficult and profound to actually have a conversation about. So, good question.
You talked a little bit about starting with Amy Schumer sort of as a jumping off point, but then the chapter got cut. I was curious about your process in choosing the women and also choosing the corresponding chapters.
Yeah.
Like, did you start out by thinking, oh, I want to write about someone who's too fat, too slutty, or you're like, Melissa, that's the one?
Yeah. I think that
Why did Amy Schumer get cut?
So there's a whole chapter, maybe the super cut of this book will have this Amy Schumer chapter and then like big X's. Actually, I had my mom, it was the first chapter that I wrote. I had my mom edit it, and my mom's like, oh, I fear, like she's always, like, she hates how much I use dashes, like ever since I was 16. She's a mathematician, she likes short sentences. And I remember being like kind of upset because she was really harsh about the chapter, but she was so right. Like I couldn't get, the original subtitle was too honest for Amy Schumer. And what was happening even then, even a year ago, so even before a lot of this stuff like has happened in the last year with her, is that I couldn't figure out, there was just such an inconsistency between what her show was saying, because I think her show really is too honest, and then what she, as a celebrity off the show, was saying. And I work with that inconsistency with Melissa McCarthy's image, and because I think that's really fascinating. I think she was very much reacting, like she talks about how when she's when she's performing, she goes into a fugue state. That's essentially unruliness. And then all of her performances, or all of her interviews, she's like, it's like in Good Housekeeping, and she's like, I love Jesus. And also, seriously, like there's one that she's like, I have a wonderful relationship with the Lord. And I don't think she's a particularly religious person. I think she just and I don't think she's lying either. I think they just probably were like, tell us about your relationship with the Lord. And she was like, I have a wonderful relationship with the Lord. But that, I could still, even though they were contradictory, they seemed to fit. Like they seemed to really be a puzzle. And with Amy Schumer, they just kept like,
one of the things you said to me about Amy Schumer was that it was like Amy Schumer's show was a curated version of her in real life persona.
Yeah.
And so that was why she was a lot more palatable as in the show format.
Right. But also that's like why she was electric on the show and why I was endlessly frustrated with her off the show. Because there's just an incoherency, and I think maybe in like her own head, and part of that is being part of the male world of stand-up, like, and the idea in stand-up that you never apologize for a joke or for anything, which again is unruly, but just in terms of the book. The other question, I picked women first, and I also obviously wanted to have not just white women, and worked hard to have, even though, and I say this in the book, like there's an overrepresentation of white women because it's so much more palatable for a white woman to be unruly. It's so much easier in a lot of ways. But I also wanted to kind of, pick some that were surprising. And then also, like, obviously I'd have Lena Dunham as part of the book, but how do you talk about everything to do with what Lena Dunham has done in the last 5 years? Like, in a way that not other people have already talked about, and that's why I focused specifically on the representation of her body. It made it into something tenable, like something that I could actually tackle and think about in an interesting way, that doing the holistic Lena Dunham would not have worked that way. Thank you.
Thank you. I've noticed in the last few years that there's always a question that's given to a celebrity, and it's always a woman. Are you a feminist?
Yeah.
And it's gone up really. I could start tracking it, I guess 2014, 2015. And sometimes you get very smart answers, in my opinion. Sometimes very boneheaded ones, like Shailene Woodley, who seems to be very socially progressive in other ways, and just had this really kind of, in my view, this huge misunderstanding of what feminism is. And I was wondering what your thoughts are. Why suddenly do they ask these questions to these women? It's only been the last 3 years. Is it? And really, the only people who talk about it are people in the feminist blogosphere.
Well, I think it's a good soundbite, first of all. Like, it's a way to excerpt an interview that's like, Taylor Swift on whether she's a feminist, you know? I also think, like, this is a long-running theory that I have, that almost always the smarter and more informed the answer is, it's almost always to do with whether or not the celebrity in question has gone to college. And that's not to say that there aren't women who didn't go to college, celebrities and non-celebrities, who don't have very sophisticated understandings of feminism. I actually think Brie Larson has a really sophisticated understanding of feminism and also lives it, and she didn't go to college, but took it upon herself to educate herself, or like other people in her life too, and also, you know, wasn't a celebrity until later. But if you've been exposed to these ideas in any sort of complex way, then you can articulate it. But like, if someone would have asked me when I was like 19 and famous what I thought feminism was, like, my mom got me this little like thing that went on my vanity when I was growing up that said like, the best man for a job is often a woman. And like, that's probably what I would have said that feminism was. Just so, but like, you know, so I think that, again, there's a way to approach those answers with more understanding and compassion, while also being frustrated that they also then become the avatar or the dominant understanding of what feminism is or is not.
Okay, gossipy question for you.
Yeah.
2 parts. Who do you think Taylor Swift voted for?
My favorite
and
question.
Will she ever get political? Because she is never political.
Yeah. So my favorite question, and I talk about this a lot. In our office actually talks about this a lot too, and I go back and forth. But right now, I think that she maybe didn't vote, and she is, though. She's from this place called Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, which is really fascinating to me. Like, almost moved there for a year just to live in Wyomissing. Not because Taylor Swift is from there, but because it is one of those places that swung from voting for Obama to voting for Trump. And it's a far, far suburb of Philly, but it's an actual suburb of this town called Reading, which has it's the highest poverty level in the United States of a city, if you're defining a city as something over 85,000. And it had, one of the reasons why it swung, or like statistically, a lot of these places that swung really fast are places where it's not very diverse, but it's getting very diverse very fast. And so you have kind of reactionary people in the suburbs who are like, what's happening to my America? Like, flipping out, but are still, you know, keeping themselves away from that. So that's where her parents are from. She grew up, you know, very privileged and, you know, white middle class, or actually white, like upper middle class. So I think in a lot of ways she's an Ivanka Voter. Her apoliticism is fascinating to me. She can't alienate her base like Trump. And I mean, she's savvy. Like, that's a smart business decision in a lot of ways, is, you know, whatever you want to think about that. But I do think that's one of the, you know, she's not visible right now because she's not in a promotional cycle, but also when her next album comes out, there is, I think, a question for any celebrity today is like, what is your political stance? What do you mean ideologically? And she's always meant things like white virginity, white victimhood, like all sorts of things. And so how comfortable or uncomfortable are we going to be endorsing or reacting to or loving that the next time around? So I'm very fascinated to see how it's going to go.
I wrote a post about the day of the Women's March that she did not attend,
right.
but she posted a photo in solidarity.
Right.
And, I think it's interesting because she trades on women's loyalty.
Yeah.
And so that is her brand.
Yeah. Girl power.
Girl power is her brand.
Yeah. Well, if anyone saw like the interview with Lorde a couple of days ago, like last
describing
week,
her as someone with an autoimmune disorder.
no, but also that Lorde, she talked about how she went to the Women's March and she was like, I didn't post about it, I didn't make it public, I just wanted to be a part of it. Which, that's a brilliant PR move because it's like, oh, like I'm so feminist that I don't need to publicize it. Like I don't need to commodify it.
Right.
And someone was saying to me, they're like, oh, maybe Lorde's like the celebrity of our moment, but she's not enough of a celebrity. Like Lorde is still like the prestige TV of celebrity. Like there's no Lorde on the cover of Us Weekly.
No,
like
I think Rihanna is the celebrity of our moment.
And Rihanna, Pierre and I, my coworker, we're talking about this. Rihanna is always all the time. Like there's never a time without Rihanna, which isn't a criticism. It just means she's everlasting. So
it's pretty great.
I think we have time. Like one more question. I guess we could do two. Go ahead.
Hi.
Hi, Emma.
Hi. So I was wondering, since your last book was about past Hollywood, and this is more about contemporary, and the idea of how the marketing of unruliness throughout time has changed since maybe say Simone de Beauvoir or some of the other people you mentioned, and how it's changed in the way that our technology and modern life has changed the way we are sold unruliness through our celebrities.
So you want to how have I done that?
Or how you think about that.
So there's this great resource called the Media History Digital Library, which is all of the fan magazines which are out of copyright. So it's searchable. Everything's scanned. I couldn't have written my first book, Scandals of Classic Hollywood, without it. And it's a treasure trove because you find things there was this incredible thing about when Mae West became a star in the 1930s. If you don't know who she is a full-figured lady who wrote her own stuff, who she didn't get married, she hung out with black people, she was very sexually forward for the time. She wrote these incredible puns, is that a banana in your pocket? Are you happy to see me? A lot of that stuff is classic Mae West, or why don't you come see me sometime, blah, blah, blah. She's great. I love her. She was also incredible. She was swiftly rejected after her peak. But there's this fan magazine article that's all about the craze against reducing. So reducing was the word for dieting during the 1930s. And so Mae West incited this essentially becoming the equivalent of today a size 8. Women were trying to not be skinny for a short period of time. But this was in a fan magazine article. And that's one of the only sort of artifacts that we have of how unruliness was celebrated and propagated during that time. And now, when I was doing this, I could go through 1 billion Instagrams. Amy Schumer blocked me because I had gone through so many of her Instagrams and I had tweeted, Amy Schumer's Instagram is really boring. And she blocked me. But that, there's just so many different channels for stars to communicate their star image, for celebrities to communicate and reify and challenge all these things, that it's harder to keep them all in concert, to keep them unified, and also to study them. So I think and they're very ephemeral, how are scholars of the future, besides looking in, the Library of Congress that has all of our tweets, how are they going to get their hands around all of this stuff in a way that's meaningful? So, and maybe, and also, a lot of these stars, Serena Williams, she's on Snapchat all the time. I don't know how to Snapchat. You can't save a Snapchat. There's so much that I didn't talk about her because I don't know how to Snapchat. And it's not that I don't know how. It's that I willingly, I have many other venues. But so that, I think that just emphasizes how much more difficult it is going to be for scholars of the future. One more. Go ahead.
Thank you. I know it might be kind of outside the bounds of this talk, but just trying to understand if you think men are actually going to be an important ally in pushing women's unruliness and how you're seeing them respond to these women. I haven't read the book yet. I'm really excited to, but trying to understand because I'm seeing a lot of unruly feminism coming from a lot of places. Like Outside Magazine is trying to push a lot more like badass women and things like that. And I'm curious to see the reaction of men, and curious even if the rest of the women here think that they're going to be an important ally in helping us push that envelope moving forward.
That is such a good question. I think so much of proper femininity is trying to make yourself appealing to men. Like, even if you're not heterosexual, like, you are still operating within patriarchy. Like, you're still trying to fit yourself, slot yourself into this regimen of, like, appeasing, appealing to, pleasing men. And so if the men in our lives or public figures are better and more vocal about not only praising, like, it's not just being like, you look beautiful however you are, baby. Like, it's not stuff like that. It's also, I think, like, not implicitly or explicitly policing, like, a guy who's like, oh, like, she looks, like, I don't know. I've heard guys just in passing be like, oh, she looks, like, she shouldn't be wearing that. Or like, that girl was too much. Like, I can't deal with her. You shouldn't invite her to the next party. And I think as women, we can also help be like, that's gross that you said that.
I think that women also have to take on the responsibility of, fighting the internalized misogyny that we all have when it comes to this stuff, both like towards ourselves and towards each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that also will help us counter the stuff that is external.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, like, it's like therapy. Like, you got to deal with your own shit before you can ask other people to deal with it as well. So, like, I am constantly working on myself, and in terms of, like, because I've internalized so much ideology, so much. We all have. Like, you don't live outside of ideology, but if you can make it visible to yourself, to other people around you, men and women, like, I think that is the most powerful thing, to be like, listen, and again, you don't have to, like, have a little media studies lecture in your bedroom, but, like, be like, here are the ways that you are reinscribing proper femininity with all these women around you. But there's just, there's conversations that you can have. And I think oftentimes the reason why I write about celebrities and why I think celebrities are important is because they provide a jumping off point to talk about these larger forces that affect all of us. So, thank you, everyone, for coming.